This week, we're going to dive back into the culture war over gender, which, as my guest will explain, also manifests itself as a civil war within the LGBT communities. That guest, gay writer Ben Appel, grew up in a Maryland-based Christian cult known as Lamb of God, in which he was taught that homosexual acts, and even mere homosexual thoughts, were a pathway to hell. In time, Ben developed an OCD-like fixation on the rituals of prayer, spending endless hours begging God for forgiveness, a centuries-old Christian reflex known as scrupulosity. Ironically, Ben's mental health problems only got worse after his family moved away from the Lamb of God cult, when Ben was 12 years old. Suddenly, he was thrown into a large public school environment that his isolated Christian upbringing had never prepared him for. In response to bullying from homophobic classmates, Ben became consumed with shame and crippling anxiety, causing him to become even more compulsive about his prayer rituals. Eventually, he self-medicated with alcohol and drugs, dropped out of college, and fell into a spiral of addiction, psychosis, and suicidal ideation. Once in his 20s, Ben went clean with the help of a 12-step program and became more comfortable with his sexuality. When gay marriage was on the Maryland ballot in the 2012 election, he became a gay rights activist and envisioned a career in the field. He'd enjoyed writing since grade school and enrolled at Columbia University at age 30, with hopes of becoming a professional writer whose work would fuel the fight for LGBT rights and social justice. Finally, he thought, after suffering through childhood traumas, addiction, and a number of false starts on the road to recovery, he'd found a community of caring, supportive people who shared his mainstream progressive values. But as it turns out, the LGBT communities he encountered at Columbia proved to be just as judgmental and cultish as the Lamb of God milieu he remembered from his childhood. As Ben will discuss, this was a time when the so-called radical wing of the gay rights movement was asserting itself at the expense of the so-called assimilationist wing, which had successfully fought for the right of gay Americans to marry and serve in the military. The radicals that Ben met at Columbia were interested in more dubious goals, such as destroying capitalism, replacing biological sex with gender identity as a marker of manhood and womanhood, and generally remaking society through an ill-defined process known as queering. And when Ben questioned these ideas in class or in print, he was disparaged by his classmates as too white and too cis, which is to say, not transgender. This treatment sent Ben into another mental health spiral, and another bout of scrupulosity. Except this time, Ben wasn't seeking forgiveness from God, but from social justice ideological enforcers who refused to tolerate dissent. Please enjoy my interview with Ben Appel, author of the newly published book, Cis White Gay, The Making of a Gender Heretic. Ben Appel, thank you so much for joining the Quillette podcast.
Thanks for having me, John.
So usually I start my podcast small and lead up to big issues, but I'm going to just start with like a big picture question here, because something I've been thinking about the last couple of years. So you and I come to kind of maybe the same political space from different directions. I worked at this conservative newspaper in the 90s and early 2000s. And from reading your book, I know that you, for a period, were kind of a mainstream gay rights activist, particularly on the issue of gay marriage. And yet the two of us kind of find ourselves in this weird political spot where disaffected liberals, disaffected progressives, certain kinds of conservatives have kind of become very aware of some of the policy distortions, let us say, that have been caused by what is sometimes grouped together as the LGBT constituency. I know that, when I talk to conservatives and also some progressives who maybe make common cause on this issue, they find it a little disorienting. Can you tell me about that? You don't strike me as someone who's particularly conservative, but
Yeah.
maybe Orthodox progressives would now lump you in with the Heritage Foundation when it comes to this
Oh,
kind of
for
issue.
sure. For sure.
Is that disorienting for you?
It was at the beginning. You kind of wear that scarlet R. It's like a scarlet letter, right wing. It's scary because right wing is bad coming from the places that I come from. It's immoral, it's evil. The huge culture shock was when I entered further and further into activist spaces, and especially after I got to Columbia, to really realize that there is this massive wing of radicals waiting, like, the moment that marriage is national, in 2015 in the US, when it is legalized nationwide, that they're like, okay, you've gotten what you wanted, now it's our turn, like, to take the helm back.
You mean the assimilationists? The assimilationists got what they wanted, and then the
Yes.
radicals said, "Okay, so that's
Yes.
done. Let's put a punctuation mark at the end of that, and now new chapter, and we're going to start queering the curriculum and stuff like that."
Yeah.
So there's these vignettes where you worked at a hair salon. A woman made she said, "What did you think about the election?" This is after Trump got elected, I think the first time. And you said something like, "I didn't realize how racist the country was." And
Hmm.
you realize she was a Trump supporter. She was sitting there getting her hair done by you, and you were calling her a
Hmm.
racist. And
Yeah.
I thought it was admirable that you included it in the book because you were showing, hey, I get it being judgmental and dogmatic because I was like that, right?
Yeah. I mean, someone would say, a coworker innocently would say something like, "Oh, that's so gay," and I would, kind of sit down with them and have a conversation like, can we talk about why that's offensive?" And I mean, there can be a time and place for these different things. I mean, if someone is gay, it's not necessarily super great to have a coworker saying that. But I mean, I say that now. I say things are gay. I spoke at a university last week and I said faggy.
Yeah, but that's like kind of ironically, you're not using that at face value, right? Like, and plus you're allowed to say that. Like I'm allowed to accuse my friends of being Shylocky or something like that.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
Actually, I probably would be misunderstood if I called them Shylocky. That's a super weird example. Dude, stop being so Shylocky. Like, what are you talking? Oh, come on, it's a thing, it's a thing we say to each other. I have to mention I'm Jewish in the intro, or all of this won't make sense.
Right. Right.
One thing that I mentioned in the introduction is that by sheer coincidence, we had a guest on a couple weeks ago. His name's Danny Wrench, who was in a cult.
Hmm.
He's the chief chess officer at chess.com, which is the super popular site where people play chess. And he wrote a book, and a publicist got in touch with me about the book and says, "Oh, John, you write about board games. Here's a great book. It's by a guy who is an executive at chess.com." And I was like, "Oh, cool." And I started reading it. And the stuff about chess, I mentioned this in the podcast, like it was the least interesting stuff in the book because
Mhm.
the most interesting stuff was him growing up in this cult, basically like a trailer park compound type thing, was I think 2 hours north of Phoenix. And he grew up there. And a lot of the book is about, well, most of the book is about growing up in this cult. Uh, and so we had this fascinating segment about cult stuff. And now just by sheer, it's not like this is cult month at Quillette. Your book comes along, and I know because a couple of years ago you wrote a great piece for us about cult life. I want to get into how hardcore cult Christian ideas created a really tortured mental relationship with you and your sexual orientation. Because I mean,
Mhm.
it's a super intense part of the book. But could you just, by way of background, tell us a little bit about what this Christian sect was like? Because it
Mhm.
doesn't sound like a normal Christian sect. It wasn't like Unitarians. It was something darker than that, right?
Mhm. Right. It was called the Lamb of God, and it was a covenant community, and it began in the very early 70s.
What does that mean, a covenant
I'm gonna
community?
tell you, yeah. So covenant communities were born out of pretty much like the Catholic charismatic renewal movement of the late 60s. And so what it was a lot of, believers, a lot of Christians who found themselves suddenly kind of blessed with these charisms, this ability to prophesy, to lay hands on each other and heal, or to speak in tongues, glossolalia, so that kind of weird mumbling, and that is written about in scripture and biblical scripture. And so there was this kind of awakening, and at the time, we're coming out of the 60s, 70s, this kind of the me generation, but also the drug haze of that era. And there was the women's movement, there was the budding gay movement, and there was even within, now this is obviously still going on, but there were a lot of people who were more conservative, more religious, that were really concerned about the liberalization of even in the church itself. Like they found that, believers in Christianity and the Christian church was drifting further away from what it had started as and what it should be. And so this kind of idea was for covenant communities, again, I say grew out of the Catholic charismatic renewal movement, which was a kind of quirky blend of Catholicism and Pentecostalism, just very sensational and emotional and that kind of stuff. Because, Catholicism can be pretty rigid and
Yeah,
kind of,
yeah.
but this was a kind of a blend of those things. So covenant communities started where these folks really kind of in the US, like in the Midwest or, Michigan, Ohio, these areas said, let's kind of form these bulwarks against this, against feminism and human secularism and Islam, and all of these things that they foresaw were going to, be the church's end, possibly. And we'll all live in the same area, and we'll have male leaders that will just follow very kind of traditional biblical values. I mean, it wasn't so much like returning entirely to Old Testament law or like, Sharia law, like Christianity's version of Sharia law. It wasn't like that, but it was very much like the men are the husband masters, the women are submissive and docile, and, and they must look to their husbands for leading. And there were a lot of rules and regulations. And so we'll all live in the same community. We'll all have a hand in each other's personal lives and raising each other's children. We'll have a school, so we'll where all of our kids go. And, a lot of that time will be spent in prayer and worship. And it'll kind of just be this bubble where we can kind of build, again, a bulwark against, what they saw going on in the secular world around them. And this really exploded. So this grew. So covenant communities are still there. So Amy Coney Barrett, she's a U.S. Supreme Court justice. She was, or I think she might still be, but was or is a member of People of Praise, which is another covenant community. And I remember when she was being considered for the position, that this was relevant and it came up a lot. People concerned about how these beliefs were going to affect her decision making in law. So anyway, this is not a something that's necessarily faded away. It actually has kind of grown, and it's more national. I mean, or international actually. But it is kind of like an offshoot, in a general way, of the broader Catholic Church. It's like a movement within the Catholic
And it
Church.
sounds like it doesn't have to become a cult. Like maybe it could just stick around
Yeah.
as a reasonably mainstream Christian community if it has the right leadership. Thing is, eventually power corrupts, and if you centralize power within a few people who are also the spiritual leaders of the
Right.
community, eventually what's going to happen?
Exactly. I mean, you have this system where, tithes are required of members. So they collect money, either monthly or yearly. It's like 10% of your income.
Mormons are like that, I think, right?
Right. And so you have where you have just male leaders at the top, and they kind of dictate how one should live. It was always like you were confessing. So there were,
Yeah.
men and women's groups and prayer meetings where it was kind of like you're just supposed to open up to the people that are above you in the hierarchy, and you're kind of just supposed to share all of your inner secrets and your inner failings. So, oh, I've lusted after this man's wife, or oh, I've had a homosexual thought, or oh, I've da da da. And then there'll be prayer, and they would all pray together and pray over each other. And then that information would kind of be brought back to the higher ups, and it would go up and down this ladder of information. So it was like the leaders, there were 5 male leaders. They were called coordinators. And there were 3 handmaids. The head women were called
They
handmaids.
were called handmaids.
They were called handmaids. And so the handmaids at the top and the coordinators at the top kind of knew what was going on I write this in the book, like the hearts and the minds of all of the people in the community. So it put them in this position to really be, coercive if they wanted to, influential, to guilt people, to shame people.
Your parents were all in.
Oh, they were all in. Well, my dad was one of the 5 coordinators. He was one of the leaders. So, and they joined in about 1976 when they were engaged to be married. So before me and my siblings came along, they joined in 76, and then they left around like 95, about like 19 years, 20 years later, 19 years later. And yeah, my dad gained authority in the community pretty quickly, not because he was this like full believer in that, jumping around and praising God and speaking in tongues and doing all this. He actually thought it was really weird, the first prayer meeting they went to, when they were in their 20s. But he had business acumen. He had an MBA, a master's of business, and he had his law degree. He was an attorney. And so the leaders at the time, they're trying to grow this budding community, and they're trying to attract more shiny, successful people. And what the verbiage they used to describe people like my parents was solid. They were very solid people. Like, they were middle class and attractive, and they had jobs, and they were and so they were like, let's get this guy into the leadership.
As you're saying this, it's eerie, the similarities with, I mentioned Danny Wrench, who I interviewed a
Right.
couple weeks ago. His father was a lawyer. His father and mother came into the cult, I think they were in their 20s, and his mother was more excited about it, and the father was skeptical. And the father became essentially the number 2 authority within the cult as an enforcer.
Your listeners are going to be like, why? What are you doing, John? Like, why do you have all these people with this?
So his name was Steve Wrench. Confusingly, the actual leader of the cult was Steve Camp. So the premise of this cult was that Steve Camp's wife, who was nominally the leader of the cult, they didn't call it a cult. No one calls their cult a cult, but the name of it was Church of Immortal Consciousness was the name of it. He became the enforcer. Anyway, sorry, I interrupted you just because I wanted to mention it because some of the readers might have the Twilight Zone music playing in their head as
Yeah,
they're listening
yeah.
to this. But one thing that's just unforgettable from reading your book is I think, like, during the period of Martin Luther, this is going back centuries, and so when you read biographies of Martin Luther's, they talk about the bath of hell, like these monks and theologians sitting around just worried about hell and having impure thoughts, and convinced that every little thing they do or everything they think or say, or if they pray the wrong way, they're all going to hell, and God is infuriated with their behavior, and that's all they think about. Feels like you were kind of in that position where you just became obsessed with the idea of God casting judgment on you. And obviously a big part of that is, as you got older, was your sexuality.
Right.
It sounds like the community was very hardline, but most of the torment was inward directed. It was you tormenting yourself, right?
1,000,000%, 1,000,000%. But the real inner turmoil and the torment came once we left the community and we were kind of ripped out of it. So we left the community when I was about 12, turning 12 and a half, let's say. I was going into my 7th grade year. My mom decided she had had enough.
But you were programmed. By that time, you were programmed.
But I was programmed from, I grew up and I was from infancy. And so this is all encoded into my bones. This is so deeply rooted. And, within that community, I write about this in the book. I say, like, life in a cult can actually be pretty great. The trouble really doesn't come until you leave and you're ripped, especially if you don't have any agency over your own rupture with it, and you're just kind of ripped out of it, and suddenly you're placed in a completely different world and you have a different understanding.
I'm sorry, I keep talking about this other guy, Danny Wrench. I'm not going to talk about him again. But
That's okay.
he makes the point that if you're 8 years old or 10 years old, being in a cult is great. You're playing in everybody's house. The whole place is your playground.
100%.
There's no fences. It's like you're running through people's kitchens.
Was he like my neighbor or something? Because really, it really was. It sounds like a very, very, very similar
You and he should
situation.
get together and compare notes,
Yeah.
because,
Well,
like,
it's very true. We all lived in this, and it wasn't a commune. So it wasn't like, but we all lived in the same in the same, however, square mile, and in the same, the leaders kind of saw this prophecy, like we should all settle in this area called Catonsville, like outside of Baltimore, the suburbs of Baltimore City, in Maryland, which is not far from Washington, D.C. And, we'll all settle in the same area. And so it was kind of like, every second or third or fourth house, like on certain streets, there was just like all community members. And it was like that. You would just wander through each other's yards. We were all on our bikes every single day. We were spending the night at each other's houses. We had father-son retreats. We had fall festivals. It was very, very idyllic in a lot of ways. But within that community, and I write about this in the book, this kind of pressure to really be perfect and to not sin, and a lot of the way that we were conditioned, the adults for sure, but my perspective is from a kid in that community. So what I learned about the adult perspective was research, was press coverage, was conversations with both of my parents, with former members of the community, with ex-members, with former leaders of the community. So that was all drawn from, I didn't know what it was like to be an adult in those situations, but I did know what it was like as a
Because
kid.
the adults shield you. They shield you from a lot of the friction that's going on among the adults,
Oh,
right? Yeah.
100 for sure. They absolutely do shield us. And they also kind of left us to, there was this very much like a kind of communal way of raising kids. I mean, it was even uh, talked about in handbooks and covenant community handbooks, like everybody in the community should like kind of have a say. Like everybody raises each other's kids and disciplines and does all these things. Like, kids should just listen to whoever the authorities are. If we made mistakes, if we erred, if we misbehaved, it wasn't like, oh, you get, detention and you're not allowed to play. It was like, you're disappointing God. Like you
That's
are
worse. That's so much worse.
well, a gazillion times worse because, it's like first of all, these leaders, when everybody is an authority and they're kind of almost like human representations of God, like my teachers, when we left the community and we were ripped out of it, and what it was we were essentially kind of just pushed out. My mom started to doubt, like she started to be known as a doubter. She was having trouble with the way things were working in the community. She was having trouble in her marriage. And so to kind of start to doubt, they just slowly pushed you out. So it's like suddenly my dad gets a phone call that like, oh, there's not money in the budget to employ him as the school superintendent anymore, or whatever. And so it was just slowly just edging them out. So we left. And besides being cut off from the friends who I had known since I was a baby, and who were kind of like siblings, extended siblings, it was the teachers. It was not having these people, these hugely influential, formative people who literally rested their hands on me and prayed over me, over my head. And, there was so much, intimacy in those, and from a really young age. And so I, that was my way to achieve salvation, forgiveness. So if I did err, if I did make a mistake, the guilt and the shame was so heavy in terms of the way that it was communicated to us by our headmaster or by our teachers, but in particular our headmaster. But it was also salvation. It was also, they showed me how I could repent, I could, and I could get right again.
There's someone to forgive you.
There was someone to forgive me. And so when I had no longer had that and I'm ripped out of everything, it is absolute free fall.
Suddenly you're in a situation where the only person who could forgive yourself is you.
Right.
And that was really hard because you were just constantly arguing with yourself about whether you were a good person. It sounds like as you became sexually aware, you kept losing that argument.
Well, yeah. So I kind of start a big part of the book like this is that I was a really profoundly girly kid. We didn't talk about this earlier, but I was a really profoundly gender nonconforming kid where, I mean, I would even be confused sometimes for a girl or say, are you a girl or a boy? But within the community, it wasn't so much because there wasn't necessarily we were such a small community. The school had 100 kids from kindergarten to 8th grade when I was there in 6th grade. So it wasn't like there was necessarily an in crowd of jocks and geeks. And then
Right.
here were the nerds. It was like everybody was part of God's army, part of Jesus. Like we were all just on fire for Jesus. And we all like, and if there were rumblings, if there were any kind of discussions or maybe offhand comments about my girliness, my effeminacy, I guess I was able to shrug it off or ignore it, at the time, being in that bubble and feeling secure in that world, but it also just wasn't so present. When I left, it was when the summer that we are leaving, actually, that we are leaving this community, my family, we go to the Delaware shore, the beach for a number of weeks in the summer. And my parents say they're going to take us down there. And then halfway through the vacation, my grandparents, my mother's parents, will come down and stay with us while my parents go back and move us from our old home to a new county, 25 minutes away, and just essentially a new life, just completely new life. So we leave our old home and then we come back to a new home and really a new world. I mean, an entirely new life. And so what was funny or, kind of just odd or makes good for reading material, I guess. Like it's just, that time when we're separating is I'm attending the public school where I had been going, the public pool where I had been going since I was a kid with friends, because we were all like, there was a public pool in the neighborhood and we would all go there. So of course we would see kids from different schools there and hang out with them and so forth. But we were mostly hanging out with each other. But there were kids started saying like, are you gay? Are you this? Are you that? Now, meanwhile, the previous year, I mean, first of all, I had been learning about the evils of homosexuality for so long. I just didn't really realize like that it pertained to me. I just ingested it and that was it. I was like, okay, they're evil, they're pedophiles, they're dangerous, they're going to hell, they're going to die of a disease, they're going to burn in hell for all eternity. They're like God, they're like the worst on God's list. When people started calling me, commenting on my let's say, for lack of a better word and term, gender expression, like if I brush my hands behind my ears, or if the way I said certain things, they started being like, oh, you're gay, you sound gay. And so I'm now connecting like, oh, there's something about, because again, I'm not like, oh my God, I'm attracted to boys. I wasn't really aware. I'm not really I'm just going into adolescence. I'm not really aware. I had crushes on girls, I mean, I had a crush on a boy when I was younger, but I didn't really interpret
It was
it.
abstract. It was
It was
abstract.
abstract, yeah. And so I was like, oh, there's a connection between this gender expression and like my femininity and this apparently homosexuality. And I mean, in Bible class in 6th grade, the year before we left the community, sodomy is a vocabulary word in my Bible class, which is taught by our headmaster. So we learned all about sodomy. I mean, this is just very much like, this is boom, boom, boom. This is how it is. So as we're leaving this, suddenly everybody starts, and so I can't really. I just have to dissociate, because that's just too kind of terrifying for me to even consider. I mean, to think, oh my God. And then again, we're ripped out of this community. Not long after that, my best friend says, I'm embarrassed to be seen with you, because kids were starting to make fun of him too for hanging out with me. So then it's just total. And so now I'm aware, like, oh, people are aware, like it's a thing. I'm girly. And so here I am about to attend public school where there's going to be like hundreds of kids in my grade, and in middle school, 7th grade. We're in this new area and I'm petrified, because I'm like, I felt like I'm glowing, like they're going to see it. They're going to see it from the very beginning. Well, and they absolutely did. I mean, from the first, second, third week in that school, they were like, are you a boy or a girl? You're a fag. I mean, there would be Ben as a fag written in like the library book, like, and so when you were talking about this kind of inner turmoil, like you were talking about, I go into that history of Martin Luther and scruples, and especially like during the Renaissance era and the Protestant Reformation and all of that, because it was so helpful for me to learn about, when I realized like this is a form. What happened was I developed a form of OCD called scrupulosity.
I learned that word from your book.
Right. And so I really didn't understand what was going on. But, for people who know about obsessive compulsive disorder, and it's hugely overused now, but there is a disorder of obsessive compulsive, and for a lot of people can be really,
And
debilitating.
you had it.
Well, absolutely. And so, for a lot of people understand it like obsessive compulsive, like hand washing, or light flicking or something like that. But it has a lot to do with, an anxiety about feeling out of control. Like, so it's a way to self-soothe. So your mind can make these connections of like, if I flick this switch 17 times, like right now I have I'm kind of this intrusive thought, or this, I'm really consumed by the fear that my mom's going to die. So if I flick the light this many times, my mom won't die. It's a superstitious.
Gives you agency. Yeah.
It gives you agency, exactly. And so I write about the Renaissance and about the development of what was called scruples. And according to books that I've read and research that I've read, which was really helpful to understand, is that around this time, when there used to be kind of like just a few mortal sins that people were just like, okay, we can't do that. But suddenly, with these theologians and all of this theology and this development of people expanding, the list was longer and longer and longer of like what was wrong and what was sinful. And so Christians, especially, like people started becoming really they were going to confession over and over and over and over and over again. It became, I read about like like a kind of an epidemic, and Martin Luther was one of those people who struggled severely with this, what would be called scrupulosity today, or with scruples. And so, and there have been other religious figures, Saint Ignatius. I mean, there have been a lot of people throughout, and it was hugely helpful for me to learn about that. But with me, again, it wasn't about hand washing. It was about prayer. It was about ritualistic stuff. So it was saying, I'm sorry, please forgive me, please forgive me, please help bad things not to happen, please forgive me. And it was a constant, very much of repentance, like a genuflecting. I had to do the sign of the cross however many times. I had to kneel before the Bible in the living room. I had to lift my hands in praise. Like, it just became this huge thing, because if I didn't, I felt so out of control. There were so much horrible things going on. My parents split up that year. I don't have my friends anymore. I'm being tortured and all this stuff. I actually started drinking alcohol that year because I just had no coping mechanism.
The one thing that's so fascinating about your book is I had never thought about the somewhat blurry line between religious ritualism
Hmm.
and clinical OCD.
Yeah.
Because when you see a person like clutching rosary beads and passionately confessing their sins or praying, you think of that as a religious phenomenon.
Hmm.
In the same way that if you see a person, washing a door handle 117 times before and after they enter a room, that's OCD. But what you were describing is kind of both. Sounds like it created, unfortunately, a glide path to alcohol and drugs, because
Oh,
no
yeah.
no human brain can go on with that kind of strain indefinitely.
Especially an adolescent one. I had no capability. I had no ability to cope with any of that and to deal with any of that. So really, the scrupulosity was actually it was a coping mechanism. It was a response similar to what alcohol became and what pot became. And what makes it so much worse, it's kind of like drugs and alcohol or anything, is that it can work in the beginning. Like, it can kind of be soothing, but then it becomes, you know, more intense, and the need becomes even stronger, and then the requirements become even longer. Like, you have to pray 17 times rather than just 7 times. And all this, and it is like drugs and alcohol. It really is like that in a lot of ways. It's just a very similar phenomenon.
When you came to terms with the fact that you are gay, that was around the you were still in the throes of alcohol and drugs. Like it again, the Hollywood movie version of it is like you realize, hey, you know what? I'm a gay man, and that creates a whole chapter of your life. But again, there was a sort of blurring because you did come to terms with your sexual orientation, but it absolutely wasn't the end of your experience with drugs and alcohol. And you described this harrowing trip to New Orleans, sort of a coming of age trip.
I had just turned 19. I went to college first semester in the fall of 2001. um Again, throughout high school, my drug use is getting worse and worse. I'm becoming more and more kind of detached from reality. Um and and I drop out of college after. I'm like, I'm just going to find myself, I'm going to travel, I'm going to, whatever. A month later, friends were going to New Orleans because a friend of mine, her boyfriend lived in Baton Rouge, and they went every year, and I was like, that sounds great.
Mardi Gras, right?
Mardi Gras.
Yeah.
So I go, and it was, what Mardi Gras would be like for a 19-year-old, essentially a drug addict who's just like looking to, party and kind of losing his becoming like total bananas. And yeah, it was just like that. I mean, I went on most of my drugs of choice were, I was like pot every day for sure, but a lot of downers. Like, I was doing a lot of opiates. Like, it really like relaxed me. I liked more downers. I liked that, opiates and opioids. And then I would do LSD, and I would do ecstasy and all of these things, and I would drink, but drinking wasn't so much a hardcore part of it. The drugs were more worked better for me. So but down there, I would occasionally do speed, and down there I went on this big cocaine binge, like, just like, I did a lot of cocaine, and it just sent me into a complete manic, like a complete, tailspin. I ended up losing my shit. I mean, I came home, and then perhaps 2 weeks later, after uh I had a complete and utter psychotic break, manic, bipolar episode, whatever you want to call it, where my grandmother passed away, my dad's mom. We're driving to her funeral in New Jersey. I split off from everybody in the road because voices are coming through the radio are telling me to, and it tells me to leave my brother alone, who was, maybe like 16 at the time, 17, like alone at a gas station, and just take off without him. And I drove across however many, 2 states, I guess, probably Maryland and Pennsylvania. I end up in like middle of nowhere, Pennsylvania, at a school where I just leave my car on the side of the road and I walk up and I say, God sent me here. And they called the police, and that was where that ended in terms of my just like total joyride. And so I was taken to the station, and then that was my first psychiatric ward stay, like the first of 4 in that year. And in the psych ward is where I really crashed and came down. And I had to go back after a week. I was there for a week, went home for a week, and had to go back because I was actually very close to committing suicide. And I thankfully told my mom, I said, I'm about to kill myself, so you need to take me back to the hospital. And she did. And then I went back, and like I said, I had a couple more stays that year. But the turning point for me was the following year when I went into 12-step programs and got sober. That was like the first thing that I needed to do, was to arrest that problem and to stop using drugs and alcohol. And that was the very first thing that I needed to do. But it was bad. It was very dark. I shot heroin. I did all of these things, and I ended up in, psych wards and emergency rooms. And it was terrifying, and it was all of the above, and it was awful. And it just got so bad for me so quickly. And, you could say, oh my, I'm lucky. I'm really one of the fortunate ones to have been able to come through that and to actually get help and to recover. I was diagnosed with schizophrenia when that happened
Oh, if
initially,
some guy
because
shows up at a school and says, "Hi, God sent me," the first
yeah,
thing I'm thinking is, yeah,
yeah,
schizophrenic. Yeah.
right. And that's what my diagnosis was at the time, coming out of the hospital, because I'm 19 years old, which I guess is a common age for that to the kind of the first break to reveal itself in males, especially.
Late
And
teens, early
so
20s. Yeah.
yeah, and so I'm, all of these things, and so I was pumped with all these antipsychotics, and all of this stuff, and turned out, it was not schizophrenia, thankfully. But I'm really lucky because to come back from a total psychotic break and to have that, a lot of I'm just really lucky. I'm grateful that I was able to stop using.
Yeah.
And
There's like a dozen things you just described there that could have ended up with you in a ditch
million
yeah,
percent.
it sounds like you got the help you needed at a time you needed it, including going to AA. But good luck and bad luck. You go to AA, but you stumble into this weird cult version of the AA. Like,
Yeah.
and by the way, just sidebar, AA in general has its critics, and there are people who say, well, just historically, people have said, well, it's a Christian thing and it's kind of a cult. But even putting that aside, could you talk a little bit about your particular branch of the AA experience really did have like legit cult, like it's kind of like your second cult.
It is really funny. It's like, it is kind of bad luck. It also is like, did growing up in a cult kind of just leave me with like a cult shaped hole where I was like, seeking that kind of,
Yeah.
that form of community, that cult like community. And like, that's how I ended up there, perhaps. But yes, it was in the Washington, DC area. And I really, again, just kind of happened into this. I was started to go to meetings because during my second stay in the psych ward, they pulled me and another gentleman out of the group. Like we had, and they said, there's people here that are going to talk about the other guy, I think, was like crack user. And so they were like, there's people here from a 12-step program. I think it was NA, Narcotics Anonymous. And they were like, they're going to come in and they're going to talk about their stories. And so for me, I was like, sure, of course you're singling me out, because obviously I can't stop using. Like I knew for years, like, that it was a problem. And so I was like, okay. So I listened to them, and so in my head I'm like, okay, I guess there's this, they kind of encouraged me, like, there's this place you can go, there's other people, you can go to meetings and you can meet other people if you want to arrest this thing and get better. And so after I got out of the psych ward the second time, I started going, and at one of those meetings I met this young man, and he introduced himself, and he was maybe 3 years older than me, just real charismatic. And this was not in DC, this was actually about a half hour, 35 minutes away, like closer to where I lived. But he said, I go to a lot of meetings in DC, you should come, I can be your sponsor, and I can help you, so on and so forth. So I was like, sure. He was kind of cute. He was straight, but he was like kind of cute. And I was like, kind of taken with him. And I was like, okay, great. Like, what up? Sure. So he came and picked me up one day, and we drove down to this big meeting, and it was called Midtown. It was like the Q group, it was called. And people can look this up, and they can read about it in the Washington Post, and they can read about it in Newsweek, which I include those information in my book. But yeah, it was a huge group in this really, really big, I think it was a church at the time. It was a hall, huge hall. And it was like so many young people. There was like an after party at they all kind of lived in houses together. And there was this after, gathering at someone's house. Um, I had spoken to him about my OCD, like I didn't know the term I didn't know how to describe it, but I had told him that I was on medication. Now, the medications I were on were not narcotic. They were like SSRIs, like antidepressants or something like that, like anti-anxiety, but not narcotic anti-anxiety. But in that group, it was like, you're not truly sober if you're taking doctor prescribed, even antidepressant. He was clearly passing on this kind of a doctrine to me. And I write about this in the book, but he like took me into his bedroom and he said, I want to show you something. And he
Yeah,
opened his closet.
his clothes. Yeah.
Yeah. And he showed, and he said, see how all of my clothes are arranged by color and how they're all like exactly 2 inches apart. And I was like, yeah. And he's like, I have OCD as well. And he's like, but I rely on God. Like I rely on God. And that's my higher power. I don't need to take any medication. Do you see what I'm saying? And so he's kind of like, do you think that you could just rely on God rather than, and so I can't remember if I stopped continuing the medication at that time. It's very possible that I did, but I remember going to these groups and going to more of these meetings in these groups and just finding these parallels between just being in it was like a congregation, like it was like being in a Lamb of God prayer meeting all over again, where there would be someone speaking and then like everybody would be laughing at the same time, but it like wouldn't necessarily be that funny.
Yeah.
And like everybody was kind of like, there was just like lingo and jargon and the way people talked and stuff and so I really kind of was desperate in a way for inclusion, because there was that cult shaped hole. So I was like, okay, I really want to do this. But a huge part of that group, but even 12-step programs in general, because it is a spiritual program, not religious, but it is spiritual. Prayer and meditation is one of the 12 steps. I mean, we sought through 11th step is we sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact
There's
with
a higher
God
power.
as we understand him. Yes, exactly. So for me, I'm this kid who can't stop praying, who's like part of the steps are, step 4 is like, we take a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves.
Wow, I know how
Well,
to do that. Yeah.
oh, 100. I was like, when I was, John, I was like so eager. I was like, we need to get started on this right away. I will write you. I was so eager to, then there was like making amends, step 9, apologizing. I was like, I'm ready to go on my apology tour. For what? I don't know. But like, I'm ready to write you a whole thesis about how horrible I am. I'm ready to, I'll pray for however many hours you want. But I also knew that it was a problem. Like, it was creating so much distress, because here I am. I know by now, of course, I'm 19, 20, 21. I knew I was gay, and I knew that I was attracted to guys, and I'm trying to reconcile what I cannot get rid of. I mean, I can't get rid of these thoughts, and I'm trying to reconcile this. And so every time I would pray all day long, it was just this constant reminder. I ended up continuing drinking. I ended up using heroin after the encounter with that culty AA group. I ended up leaving. I couldn't deal. I was like, I'm out of here. After a couple months, and I ended up going back out, and my drug use got profoundly worse. Like I said, I ended up shooting heroin, and I ended up in the psych ward a couple more times, in the ER. But then the following year, I ended up coming back to 12-step programs, and it thankfully stuck. And I found one that wasn't super culty, and it was just like, I found friends, young people who were like, there was no like requirement to believe this or to believe that or do this or do that. It was much looser and more just about like hanging out, smoking cigarettes at the diner till like 3 a.m. And it just was great.
The fact that you were keeping a journal from such a young age suggests a quality of self-awareness. You're a good writer, and it's something now you're doing now professionally. But was the writing just an outgrowth of just these thoughts that you had to put on paper?
I was always a writer. I mean, person who first encouraged me to write was my like the most fanatical teacher that I had in the Lamb of God, like not
Really?
like total nutso. But she had us during the day. There would be journal time, and I was like 9, 10. I think this began in fourth grade, so about 10 years old. And she had us like it was like meditation, prayer time. I mean, so much was meditation and prayer time, but there was a time to write in your journal, and I liked it. Like I enjoyed writing.
But would she read it?
No,
Okay,
no.
interesting, interesting.
Yes, it was like developing your own. I mean, it was, I guess, in her mind, like this way to like, communion with God, commune with God. And I mean, when I go back, a lot of my entries were like, prayer or scripture or that kind of thing, talking to God specifically. But actually the writing to God didn't become similar to like this OCD, the prayer thing didn't become such a common thing until after we left the community. Again, while I'm in the community, like I said, it's when I went back and looked at these journals, I was expecting it to be like it was after I left, like, God forgive me, God help me, I'm a sinner, this and that. It wasn't at all, because I was in this bubble. I was safe. I could be like a normal kid. Now, again, there was like shame and all of this coercion and stuff, but I was safe within the community. I had salvation so long as I was a part of this group. So I could write, oh, I can't stand Dave, he sucks at basketball, or I can't stand da da da. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
oh, Mark asked Sarah out, and she said no, but of course she said no because he's stupid. You know what I mean? All of this
It's
stuff.
like Dawson's Creek stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
so I was like, wow, because a couple years later, my journals became entirely God for like, forgive me, you are most gracious and I love you and help me. I mean, really just utterly, totally different, but because I wasn't in that space anymore.
Sounds like the original journals are uh, more interesting from a gossipy perspective.
Totally. They're funny. I mean, I include excerpts in the book.
Okay, so let's go back to the chronology. So you eventually got the help you needed, and then it sounded like this is sort of for a period you were a workaday hairstyling professional.
Mhm.
You didn't write, "Oh, I was always burning with the desire to be a gay rights advocate." Gay marriage came to Canada about a decade before the United States, and I remember at the time I had a political opinion, which I guess was kind of like your opinion before your epiphany, which pleased nobody. I was the only person, I literally the only person in Canada who had this opinion. Because people asked me, I was an editorial writer for a newspaper, and people said, "Are you pro-gay marriage or not, or anti-gay marriage?" And I was like kind of a self-hating male. I didn't think men had the emotional discipline to maintain a monogamous domestic relationship on their own. So my position was marriage should be an arrangement between two individuals, at least one of whom is a woman. And so I was all in favor of lesbian marriage because I thought they were overqualified for marriage. And straight marriage, I thought I could manage. But like gay marriage, it's like two 14-year-olds driving a car. You can't do it. Like,
Hey, you're not wrong.
but it sounds like you kind of had a similar opinion. Like you just didn't think marriage was for gay men at the time before.
Mhm.
Is that the case?
Yeah. I mean, I did. I didn't think that deep down that we were, and from my own experience, that we were like capable.
Was that a shame thing though?
Yeah, it probably was a little bit of a shame thing, but it was also, I also had this understanding of marriage too as like kind of an antiquated institution. I mean, look, I'm young and I'm in my 20s, and so a lot of times you're kind of pulling ideas from your friends and from whoever you're around. I was parroting ideas. I hadn't necessarily done all of the work of sitting and being like, what do I really think about commitment and marriage and all this, the institution? But as a young person in my 20s, I had broken up with my boyfriend. It was hugely painful because I felt super guilty, but we maintained a good relationship. The first serious boyfriend that I had, and I was like super super psyched to be single because I was like, it was hard for me to do that and to break up, and I'm like, this is my life. Like, I'm gonna be single for the rest of my life, and I'm happy to. And it was almost like, I guess, because it wasn't working in that relationship, but I cared so much about him. I'm like, maybe it's just not for gays. Like, maybe this just isn't. And I mean, it was super super solipsistic like view. Like, it was a very self-centered view of like, oh, universalizing my own experience. But I did think maybe it's not for men. And I, again, like you, I understood sex differences. I understood how men were, and I understood, more about my own sexuality just as a male being. But I did. Mostly I thought this is an antiquated institution and I want it legalized for equality's sake. Like when they were starting to have discussions in 2000, 2009, 2010, like this is when it really started in the States because, um, uh, and especially around 2011, like Joe Biden, vice president, came out and said, like, I both support gay marriage, really like preceding Obama, and it kind of created a big PR problem for Obama because everybody was like, oh, your vice president thinks this. Well, now what do you think? And he had said before, like, I believe in civil unions, but I don't believe. And so he ended up prior to the 2012 election when he's trying to get reelected, he comes out as being supportive of this. And it was a very divisive topic at the time, really. And so, yeah, so I'm starting to be aware of this, but I'm like, it just doesn't pertain to me. So, for them, absolutely. But I think I'm just not for marriage. But then that changed in 2011 when I met my husband because I fell really hard. We 3 months into it, I was like, I want to marry this guy. And he felt the same way. It was totally different than what I had ever experienced. And it made me feel like suddenly, I mean, it's so cheesy, but it's like now I suddenly knew what they were singing about in these love songs for all this time. Like now I suddenly knew
Right.
when I would watch a romantic movie, I was like, oh, like when there's that denouement, like when there's the big, like now I get it, And so I, meanwhile, am like, okay, coincidentally, serendipitously, whatever it is, this is late 2011, 2012, in early 2012, the Maryland state legislature, which is where I live, Maryland, passes a same-sex marriage bill.
Right.
So 5 months, 6 months into my relationship where my now husband and I are like really kind of I'm really just in love and just this and that, and just excited about thinking about the future, about what's possible, about, just kind of he's meeting my family. I don't know. It was just exciting. And it was just an exciting time. And it was also, how people can be when they first fall in love. And that was when I became involved because I thought, well, I have a hat in the ring now. And I just felt like maybe there's something I can do. And I was starting to get like email, you see posts or emails from like Equality Maryland, which was the gay rights organization. Like there was an offshoot called Marylanders for Marriage Equality. And they were like, come join us, come help, come electioneer, come volunteer, come organize. And I went and I went to these organization meetings and I did. And I was suddenly like, yeah, okay, I'll do this. And I was starting to talk to people about it. And then election day comes around and I'm electioneering at the school, this elementary school, and I'm holding this sign, vote yes on question 6, which was the ballot initiative. But I was like sure that we weren't going to win. I was like, because I'm like, there's certainly people like, no, it's just not going to happen. I was just a pessimist and I'm very, very cynical. And we won, 52% to 48% of the voters in Maryland voted to uphold it. And then all of the measures nationally won. That was what changed for me because again, like you said earlier, oh, you weren't really like, oh, I'm going to become a gay rights activist and all this. Like you
Well,
weren't
you
primed for that.
describe it almost as a psychological phenomenon as opposed to
Yeah.
a political phenomenon because you describe this very evocative scene that after the celebration party, you describe driving home in your car in the wee hours, thinking back in the moment, you're like, this is a euphoric thing. I helped in a small way accomplish the social change. You wanted that feeling to keep going. And so you're looking for new causes because, well, you win gay marriage. And so I thought it's one of the things that makes your book interesting because, you know, it's not a conservative polemic against, oh, all these militant activists. You describe the joy that you get from getting results on a cause that you believe in and that you still believe in. But from a personal point of view, it wasn't like, okay, well, I got what I want, time to go back to hairdressing. It was you want to keep chasing that feeling and affecting social change. And I guess in that moment, you're kind of a stand-in for a lot of the LGBT community because it's sort of like any other political thing where you accomplish what you want And then you still have these organizations that they still have money, they still have mandates, they still have manpower, and they look for other causes because there's all sorts of causes out there, which I guess that to some extent, that's what set us on the road to maybe a more expansive idea of trans rights, which I think at the time you supported, right?
Yeah, I did, and I didn't know what I was supporting per se. I mean, very soon after the marriage equality was passed, then in the following legislative session in early 2013, so now marriage is legal, and they were trying, states have anti-discrimination laws, which probably it's like this in Canada and other places as well, where you can't, it's legal to discriminate against certain groups of people in housing. You can't deny them housing or employment. You can't say like, I'm not going to hire you because you're gay, that kind of thing, or you're black, or you're a woman. And so they were going to add gender identity to that act. So you can't discriminate against color, creed, sexual orientation, gender identity, right? So that was for trans people. So you couldn't discriminate. Now, at the time, I'm like, thinking, yeah, like I didn't really know a lot of trans people. I knew maybe like one or two trans identified people, but I didn't really know. And I hadn't really thought deeply about like what it meant. If you were to ask me, I would say like, oh, people were born in the wrong body.
And to be fair, whatever it does mean, I agree that you shouldn't be able to deny a person an apartment because they have gender dysphoria. I mean,
Right. Exactly. So I was fully on board. What I didn't know about at the time was how consequential adding this kind of ethereal or circularly defined thing into policy, into law and policy, would lead us to where we are today, where like a black lesbian woman is in the locker room. We've maybe seen this story
yeah, yeah.
recently, and this has happened. And she turns around and there's a naked man there, and then she's kicked out of the gym because she objects. So I wasn't aware of how this would be consequential for women's rights, for it just hugely. Sex is profoundly consequential. It's very important to acknowledge in medicine, in law, and policy. 2013 I'm doing this, then 2014 I get married, early 2015 I'm back in school. Like I went to, because I said to I'm like, I want to do more. I want to be an activist. And I imagined like writing for like HuffPost queer voices, or like,
You weren't saying like I'm dreaming of writing for this thing that doesn't yet exist called Quillette, where they're gender critical, which is also something that doesn't exist yet. Like you were the opposite, right?
I was a hardcore believer still. I was like, I'm going to go to school. I'm going to hashtag resist the Trump administration, who Trump got elected in the end of 2016. I was as woke, for lack of a better word, as they come, and I was super geared up for it. And and then after a year of community college, I got accepted to Columbia, and I began to finish my undergraduate degree. So I would be attending Columbia for 3.5 years to finish my undergraduate degree in my 30s. And so my husband and I moved to New York, and my first semester began in January 2017, which coincidentally, it began the week that Trump was inaugurated for his first term. And so I am like head down, like I'm going to become the most effective writer and activist against the right, against conservatism and activism. And I mean, I'm fascism and Christian fundamentalism and all this stuff. And then yeah, it was a huge, there was a huge pivot, not a pivot, but just a complete awakening that occurred from studying and learning and being in this world, in this space at Columbia. And it was very, very different than what I thought it was going to be. I thought it was going to be like kumbaya with my people, and instead it was, just a bunch of assholes, telling me that I wasn't queer enough, that I was cis, that I was something called cis, and that, all this stuff. I'm sitting next to somebody who's telling me, this young woman who has a boyfriend, who's like scrolling through Grindr, and she's saying how she's also gay, and I'm like, what are you? And suddenly, like, this person is like representative of like the new kind of dogma. I mean, it really was the new orthodoxy. This wasn't, something that was on the outskirts. Like, this person was working at GLAAD, like this is, at a gay rights organization. Like, these are the thinkers. These are this is where it all goes down. This is where people decide they tell everybody else how to think about this stuff. And I was like, oh my God, I don't vibe with this, but I stuffed it down, I held it and I was like, tried to re-educate myself. I did my best to like, and just to kind of go along. But that critical thinking faculty, having been in my 30s, growing up in a cult, going through, I'm like, I'm not, I'm sorry.
There must have been a kind of, oh, not again feeling for you, because it's like you survived the Christian cult and then you survive this weird AA cult.
Yeah.
Like, phew, well, that's over. I mean, what are the chances of landing in a third cult? I mean, that would be crazy. I guess I'll just go to Columbia, this wrought iron bastion of higher learning where rationalism prevails and
Yeah.
cultism is the last thing I have to worry about. And then a couple of months are like, oh, fuck, it's happening again. Like, is it me? Like, am I wasn't it sort of like, God, why do you torment me? Like, it's like the Bible, things are
Job
coming
or
in threes. Yeah. So, if I were in your position, I would have said, I tried so hard to find a community in my life, because everyone wants a community, right?
right.
There's a lot of people like, they call themselves heterodox. I guess I call myself heterodox.
Mhm.
Humans are social creatures. We don't want to be heterodox. A lot of heterodox thinkers, the first thing they do is you get four heterodox people in a room together and they're like, let's create a new orthodoxy. Because
Right.
people want that. Before I let you go, can you give us a sense of like when the breaking point came for you at Columbia, when it was just like, it was clear that you couldn't really toe the line?
Maybe when I started having panic attacks. When I had my first panic attack where I woke up at 3 in the morning and I had a panic attack that was unlike anything I had experienced since I was in the psych ward at age 19.
And God wasn't going to
And
help you on this one. Like, this
no,
was,
and
yeah.
I was terrified because I was like, "Ugh, I'm" it was terrifying. It was and I was like, I that was where it really started
And what was
for
the
me, I
fear
think.
that was in your head? Like, because panic starts with a germ of legitimate fear. What was
Yeah,
the
so you were saying too, like, "Oh, suddenly I'm in this cult. Is it me?" And it was really, I mean, yes, you could say it was me, but it was also just the what I was searching for. I was trying to be righteous, and so for the first time getting into activism, maybe even that night on election night when I was driving home and I'm like filled with this high that I want to keep chasing, it was the first time that I felt righteous again. Like since I had left the community, like I had a new calling. I was like one of the good guys. I was on the right side of history. Like, whereas before I was part of God's army, now I'm part of a new army. And this is like, it just felt serendipitous. It felt so many things. It really did. And so this is the way that I'm achieving my new righteousness. So now suddenly I'm like in this place where I'm like all gung ho. And now I'm not living up to these moral standards because I'm not agreeing with this orthodoxy or professing a faith in it or following the dictates of it. My pronouns are still he, him, and I'm, whatever the fuck, I mean, that was what the most disturbing part was, is just this, it in this experience, and that's so much of the book is about my time at Columbia and afterwards, is it exacerbating this OCD, this scrupulosity, where suddenly I'm doing all these repetitive prayers, praying. I don't know to what God, to who, but I'm constantly self-scanning for signs of immorality in terms of how am I disagreeing with the dogma here? Like, how am I, and trying to silence my own thoughts? Like, if I have a dissenting opinion, if I'm starting to think, trying to be like, oh gosh, you can't think, like, don't go there, or just keeping myself quiet and really trying to just be the best little gay LGBTQ plus queer activist.
In some ways, was your mother an example for you? Because it sounds like your mother kind of called bullshit a little bit, not in those terms, on some of the stuff that she saw at Lamb of God.
I write in near like in the first part of the book about like the community and the Lamb of God, like how my mom became a doubter.
And that was enough. She didn't they kicked her, they kind of effectively kicked her out before she went full heretic, right?
Yeah, I mean, again, it wasn't like, it was just like a nudging. It was like a pushing out. Like again, there was just suddenly opportunities weren't there, and then suddenly it was like, it's like a slow canceling. You know what I mean? It was like a canceling, and so, but again, my mom was like ready to leave. She wanted to leave, so um, yes. So my mom, I guess, was of influence in a way, but she and I write a lot about a lot of her in the book. She and I have a very close relationship, and we absolutely relate wholeheartedly, so closely about that feeling of guilt and fear and this even scrupulosity. Learning, in the past number of years, interviewing my mother and learning all these things and realizing like, oh, she had a very similar or the same kind of disorder. Like she tells me about times when she stayed up at night and she was repeating these prayers out the window, and then her father walked. She was like 9 years old, and her father walked in, and she was embarrassed because he was like, "What are you doing?" And she didn't want to say, but she felt like she had to, because she grew up in a very religious atmosphere, and that was what attracted to her to the Lamb of God at the beginning. Was it began in the 70s as this kind of like peace and love, former hippies, like on fire for Jesus, mercy, grace, like everybody's welcome, we love you. And that was great. That was a reprieve for her from like the kind of really rigidity of the Catholic Church and the Catholic school that she had grown up in. And so she was like, this is what I need. And then it turned into that same kind of thing, or even worse.
That woman you sat next to in class at Columbia, did she find love on Grinder?
I actually sat next to her at Glad. She didn't go to Columbia. She went to a different school. If you want to hear something crazy, Grinder, this gay dating app, has a policy where so-called cis males cannot filter out in terms of their searching for other males. They can't exclude because it says in their policy, because we all know trans men are men. But they do allow trans men to filter out us because they say in their policy, but we all know how much trans people need community and need connection. It's absolutely bonkers. And that doesn't mean that there aren't some men who perhaps have bisexual tendencies and they're open to having sex or hooking up with female-bodied people, with females, whether they masculinize or not. Perhaps there's a such thing as a bisexuality, and it's out there and it happens. There's also such a thing as men understanding and learning that there are a lot of females on these dating apps that are really eager to hook up, and maybe they're not gay or bi at all. They're just like, oh, I'm going to go on this website and see if I can get, what I mean? Or perhaps they do hook up with both or whatever.
Has anyone started a Grinder for people who enjoyed Grinder 10 years ago before it was full of people like this?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, I think Quillette has covered this in the pages. I mean, there's the case in Australia,
That's in the female context, right?
and has who have any men,
Yeah, yeah.
like male only. I don't think so, because they would get, they would probably find themselves in the same situation as Sal Grover, who's in that Tickle versus Giggle situation where, she lost that case and they said you have to allow males on the all female platform.
Ben Appel, thank you so much for being on the Quillette podcast, and congratulations on your book, which is called Cis White Gay. There's an excerpt at Quillette. By the way, I saw there was a big spread on the Wall Street Journal quoting you at length. So good stuff.
Thank you so much, John. I appreciate it.